Taylor Hayes walks through her office at the end of a long day knowing that the air between her and Deacon Sharp has changed in ways she cannot name without crossing into forbidden territory. Every rule she has built her professional life upon tells her to pull back, to restore the clean distance between doctor and patient. But her heart no longer obeys her head. Deacon has become more than another man in crisis. He has become the echo of every wound she thought she had cauterized. As she listens to him speak about loneliness and the wreckage of loving a woman like Sheila Carter, Taylor feels her objectivity slipping grain by grain. The room is no longer a clinical space, but a confessional, and each confession ties her closer to him. The ethics of their sessions begin to erode under the quiet hum of shared pain. Taylor tells herself that empathy is part of healing, that she can manage the boundary even as she feels the pulse of attraction every time Deacon looks at her with gratitude. She doesn't see it as betrayal, not yet. She sees it as understanding until she starts dreaming about him and wakes with guilt pounding in her chest. Meanwhile, Sheila is unraveling. Since Deacon moved out, her sense of control has collapsed into panic. He had been her redemption, the one man who convinced her that she could live without manipulation or violence. Now, his absence scratches at her like withdrawal. She tells Lee Finnegan that Deacon was the only person who ever made her want to be better, that losing him means losing her last tether to sanity. Lee listens warily. She knows Sheila's language of desperation and how quickly it curdles into menace. Sheila insists that she only needs Taylor's help, that Taylor can persuade Deacon to forgive her. But there's a darker current beneath her plea, the suspicion that Taylor is the reason Deacon hasn't returned. When Sheila confides that she saw them together once and embraced to intimate for a therapist and her patient, Lee's unease sharpens into alarm. Sheila may be asking for help, but what she really wants is vengeance if the truth confirms her fears. Taylor's internal struggle becomes visible to everyone around her. Ridge notices her distraction. Hope catches her defending Deacon with uncharacteristic warmth, and Brooke senses the pattern of yet another forbidden entanglement. Taylor dismisses their concerns, insisting that she's fine, that her sessions with Deacon are purely professional. But the veneer cracks when Deacon begins arriving unannounced, his voice softer, his words edged with need. He tells her she makes him feel seen in a way Sheila never did. Taylor knows she should stop him, refer him to another therapist. But she doesn't. She rationalizes that breaking their connection now would undo months of progress. What she doesn't admit is that she no longer wants to lose him. At the same time, Sheila's paranoia metastasizes. She convinces herself that Taylor is seducing Deacon out of pity, stealing her husband under the guise of counseling. The image drives her into obsession. Sheila has never been good at patience, and the more she imagines them together, the more dangerous she becomes. When she storms into Lee's office, her voice shakes with rage. She tells Lee that if Taylor sleeps with Deacon, she will kill her. Lee's face hardens. She has seen Sheila at her worst. This isn't a bluff. Lee warns her to stay calm, to let her handle it, but Sheila's threat hangs in the air like the promise of a storm. Lee decides that if she can't reason with Sheila, she can at least prevent the spark. She starts watching Taylor closely, waiting for confirmation of the affair she dreads. Taylor, oblivious to the trap closing in around her, continues to meet with Deacon. Each session grows more personal. He brings coffee. She doesn't tell him to stop. He asks about her own heartbreak. She answers. The walls between them crumble quietly until one evening, when their hands brush, and the silence that follows lasts too long. Taylor steps back, horrified by what she almost allowed. But the damage is done. The next morning, Lee arrives at her office unannounced. She has seen enough the looks, the rumors, the energy, that no professional line could justify. Lee warns Taylor that she's walking toward destruction. She tells her that Sheila knows that if she doesn't end this now, it won't just cost her license, it could cost her life. Taylor freezes. She knows Lee is right, but she can't undo the emotions that have already taken root. When Deacon shows up later that day, she tells him they must end their sessions, that they've crossed a line. Deacon looks wounded, asking if she really believes he's just another patient. Her resolve wavers. For a second, she imagines a world where she isn't Dr. Taylor Hayes, where she can follow her heart without consequence. Then she sees the fear in Lee's eyes and remembers Sheila's history, the bullet that almost killed her, the chaos that followed. She forces herself to say goodbye, but her tears betray her. Sheila, watching from the shadows outside the building, sees the hug that ends it. To her, it looks like proof of betrayal. She doesn't hear the words, only sees the closeness, the tenderness, the betrayal she has already written in her mind. That night, she tells Lee that she's done asking for help. Lee realizes too late that she's losing control of the situation. She pleads with Sheila not to do anything reckless, but Sheila's voice is calm in a way that terrifies her. Sheila has entered the cold clarity she always reaches before violence. Taylor spends the evening replaying her last conversation with Deacon. She tries to draft her resignation from the case, to write the letter that will formally report the ethical violation before someone else does. But she can't finish it. She knows the board will strip her license, that the press will destroy her reputation, that Ridge will see this as proof she's still self-destructive. Her phone rings. It's Lee. Taylor doesn't answer. At that same moment, Lee leaves her a message. Sheila's coming for you. By the time Taylor checks it, the night has already swallowed the city. The sound of tires on gravel outside her house makes her freeze. For a second, she tells herself it's nothing. But deep down, she knows who it is. Deacon, sensing danger, drives to her place after Lee calls him to. He arrives just in time to see Sheila's car parked under the trees. What happens next is chaos, voices raised, tears, accusations that blur together. Sheila demands the truth. Taylor admits nothing, but doesn't deny enough. Deacon steps between them, trying to de-escalate. Sheila's rage spills over, years of abandonment and betrayal crashing into this one moment. The threat she made to Lee was not idle, but something in Deacon's eyes stops her from pulling the trigger she might have pulled in another life. She drops the weapon, screaming that she doesn't recognize herself anymore, and runs. When the police come, Taylor's hands are shaking so badly she can't sign the statement. Lee arrives soon after, torn between relief and fury. She tells Taylor that she's lucky to be alive, and that the board will still hear about the boundary violation. Deacon, shattered, realizes he has lost them both. The aftermath leaves no one untouched. Taylor faces an inquiry that could end her career. Lee wrestles with guilt for not stopping Sheila sooner. Sheila disappears into the night, her promises of redemption reduced to ash. Deacon is left alone again, haunted by the wreckage of two women he cared about and the realization that he's the common denominator in every tragedy he touches. The scandal spreads quickly through Los Angeles. The medical board demands Taylor's explanation, and the Forresters brace for another public humiliation. Ridge offers quiet support, but cannot hide his disappointment. Brooke shakes her head, muttering that history always repeats itself. Taylor stands before the committee, recounting everything with clinical precision. She admits her mistakes, but insists she never intended harm. Whether they believe her is uncertain. Outside, reporters swarm, asking if she regrets choosing emotion over ethics. She says nothing. The story ends not with resolution, but with the haunting knowledge that the line between healer and human has never been thinner. Sheila's return to violence is inevitable, Deacon's remorse is hollow comfort, and Lee's attempt to do the right thing has made her complicit in a cycle no one can fully break. Taylor walks out of the hearing into the blinding light of cameras, stripped of titles, but perhaps closer than ever to understanding why the heart is the most dangerous patient of all. Lee Finnegan understands that the cleanest scalpel in a hospital is sometimes paperwork, and when she studies the wreckage forming around Deacon Sharp, Taylor Hayes, and Sheila Carter, she recognizes a triage scenario that the emergency room cannot fix because the hemorrhage is ethical, reputational, and emotional all at once. So she chooses the instrument designed for lasting hemostasis, a formal complaint to the Medical Ethics Board that will freeze the drift between therapist and patient before it hardens into scandal. Signal to Sheila that violence will not reclaim lost ground without detonating her own future, and force a reckoning that no private plea could manage. The logic is brutal but precise. If Taylor is compelled by an external authority to step back, the blurring of boundaries stops, the therapeutic relationship ends under regulatory light, and the rumor mill loses oxygen. If Sheila is made to understand that any retaliatory move will be read through the lens of a pending board action with police-adjacent consequences, then the most dangerous variable in Los Angeles, the instant, heat-seeking revenge impulse of a cornered Sheila, is effectively restrained not by sentiment, but by self-preservation. Lee prepares the documentation the way she prepares for surgery, indexing dates and micro-behaviors that in isolation might read as human frailty, but, in sequence, form the unmistakable contour of a dual relationship. The lingering touches at doors, the unscheduled visits logged by reception, the reports of an embrace following a termination conversation that should have been sterile, and the accounts of Taylor's growing advocacy for Deacon that sounded less like clinical neutrality and more like a woman arguing with herself through the body of a man she could save if only the rules bent. Lee's goal is not punishment. She is an architect of order, drawing a line that protects the system as much as the individuals caught in it, because she knows too intimately what happens when private boundaries fail and public harm follows. Yet she also sees the secondary blast radius the complaint will create. Once the board opens an inquiry, Deacon becomes a file, a case number, an object of scrutiny stripped of context. and everything that made him feel seen in Taylor's office will be recorded as evidence. His vulnerability will look like leverage, his gratitude like grooming, his recovery like a story shaped to seduce sympathy, and in that fluorescent light both Taylor and Sheila could lose him, not to another person, but to the cold apparatus of accountability that moves forward without their consent. Even so, Lee decides that the cost of inaction is higher. She drafts the narrative with a clinician's steadiness, careful to ground every inference in observable facts, refusing to editorialize even when memory pricks with images of Sheila's past detonations and the bullet that once silenced Taylor's pulse. She includes a risk assessment highlighting the proximity of an aggrieved spouse with a violent history to an alleged boundary collapse, not as a threat, but as a material hazard that justifies expedited review. She anticipates the inevitable accusation that she is meddling to protect Sheila rather than the public, and inoculates her submission with a parallel concern that Taylor's license, earned across decades of legitimate work, deserves due process now rather than the death by headlines that would follow a tabloid expose, which is what will arrive if the family whispers reach the wrong blogger before the board. When Lee finally hits send, she does not feel victorious. She feels the way a surgeon feels after amputating to stop sepsis, saved life, lost limb. The ripples begin at once. The board acknowledges receipt and issues a preliminary hold. Taylor must suspend all direct contact with Deacon until an investigator conducts interviews and reviews records. She is advised to submit a full accounting of appointments, referrals offered, consultations sought, and any mitigating steps taken once she perceived risk. The language is clinical, the tone neutral, but Taylor reads banishment in every clause and shame in every citation. She sits at her desk and drafts a response that vacillates between confession and defense. She explains the precipitating pressure's ridge's gravitational pull, Brooke's history with Deacon, the weight of being forever cast as the moral counterweight to the Logan chaos, and then she strips those out because the board adjudicates conduct, not melodrama. And she finally writes what matters, that she recognized the erosion, attempted to end the treatment relationship, and failed to maintain the optic of distance at the exact moment optics mattered most. She encloses schedules, emails recommending a transfer of care, a draft referral to a colleague with substance use expertise, and a signed note from Deacon acknowledging termination of therapy. None of it erases the impression that she waited a breath too long to slam the door. Deacon's world contracts into questions. His employer asks whether his recent absences connect to an ethics investigation. Hope Logan, trying to be kind, warns him that any public association with Taylor during the inquiry could be read as complicity. Brooke Logan, who has tolerated more second chances than any reasonable person, mutters that proximity to scandal is his favorite relapse, and Ridge Forrester, protective in a way that always arrives a chapter late, demands to know whether Deacon exploited vulnerability to climb a ladder Taylor should never have placed in front of him. Deacon, who finally found a voice in that therapy room, feels it evaporate under the macro lens. Every word he said in confidence now feels like a weapon someone else could aim. He considers disappearing, leaving Los Angeles, refusing interviews, letting silence be his only statement, but disappearance, he knows, is indistinguishable from guilt in a city that sells narrative certainties at wholesale. He schedules his own consultation with a new therapist, not to prove compliance, but because he needs a place where his name is not a headline. He drafts a simple note for the investigator that he never asked for or received anything beyond care, that he did not want a blurred line, that ending the sessions hurt precisely because they worked. The investigator's arrival turns the personal into process. Staff at Forrester Creations recounts sightings without flourish. A barista remembers two coffees with the same custom milk order placed minutes apart that always left the shop in the same hand. A building camera shows Taylor and Deacon in an elevator not touching, not speaking, only standing too close for strangers and too far for lovers in the exact posture that ignites gossip. The picture that emerges is not salacious so much as human, and that humanity is both Taylor's only defense and the foundational problem. Ethics codes exist to protect patients from human frailty masquerading as exceptional destiny. Sheila watches all of this like a hawk, starving and terrified of her own claws. Lee's maneuver has wrapped her in legal tripwires. Any misstep will validate the board's fear profile and reroute her into a custody of a different sort, one that would guarantee permanent separation from Deacon and Finn and any other lifeline she might claim. The complaint, perversely, becomes her leash and her shield. She cannot storm Taylor's house without proving every accusation true. So she swallows vow and rehearses contrition, just loudly enough to be overheard by the right people. Nevertheless, the longer the file stays open, the more Deacon recedes from her reach, transformed into a subject who cannot be contacted without lawyers CCD. She phones him once and hangs up twice, writes a letter and burns it, prowls the edge of her old self, and remembers the exact shade of orange in prison jumpsuits. She reminds herself daily that Lee did this to save her, not to cage her. But the distinction feels academic when the person she calls her husband will not return home while his name circulates through conference rooms. Ridge and Brooke split the difference between concern and condemnation with the hypocrisy of veterans. They want Taylor safe and sober in her judgment because it justifies their own myths about why they're inevitable. And they want Deacon far from any Forrester because that, too, keeps their storylines tidy. Hope, caught between a father she loves and a woman she respects, drafts a statement that she never releases. One insisting that healing is messy and that the board should weigh intention alongside impact. She deletes it because she knows intention is the siren song that drags ships onto rocks in every scandal she has ever seen. Finn and Steffi, veterans of the Sheila Wars, become quiet. Finn thanks Lee for acting before bullets and sirens return to their vocabulary. Steffi wonders whether their gratitude will look like betrayal if Taylor loses her license. And she hates that on this show survival so often looks like disloyalty in slow motion. The board's timeline remains glacial compared to tabloid metabolism, so the city fills the vacuum with its own verdicts. Columnists rehearse old grievances against Taylor and speculate on a Logan Forrester love geometry that always finds a way to equate female empathy with hunger. Commenters postulate that Deacon engineered the dynamic because his sobriety thrives on iteration. Defenders insist that the real villain is Sheila's shadow, which bends every person in its radius toward extremes. Through it all, Lee remains disciplined. She does not leak, does not grandstand, does not allow anyone to paint her as Sheila's enforcer. She visits Taylor once, not to gloat but to offer practical help drafting a remediation plan should suspension come continuing education in dual relationship avoidance, supervised practice periods, a transparent referral network, and she is relieved in a way that surprises her when Taylor listens without pride and asks good questions. Lee also visits Sheila because accountability without accompaniment is cruelty, and tells her in unvarnished terms that if Deacon is to be saved for either of them, he must first be saved from the crossfire. A marriage reclaimed through coercion is not a marriage, and a reunion purchased with blood is a countdown to the next catastrophe. Sheila hears the truth but wants a promise. Lee refuses to issue any assurance except the only one she can enforce, that if Sheila remains nonviolent and the process plays out, no one will be able to hang a new crime around her neck. The fulcrum of the story arrives not with a ruling, but with an opportunity for everyone to choose what kind of ending they can live with. The board schedules interviews on the same day for Taylor and Deacon. Taylor arrives with documentation and humility, ready to accept sanction if it protects the future of her work. She does not beg to keep her license so much as she argues to keep serving safely, pledging structural changes that would prevent another drift. Deacon arrives alone, refusing a publicist, refusing the script someone offered him that would have turned him into a prop for absolution. He tells the panel that he will not help destroy the woman who helped him breathe again, that if punishment must be dealt out, it should be proportional to harm, and he suffered none at her hands. He also tells them that he cannot return to treatment with her even if the board allowed it, because healing cannot be a place where either person is thinking about who is watching. The honesty moves the room, but does not absolve the code. Compassion is not a clause. The preliminary finding lands like a gavel without echo. Taylor will face a temporary suspension paired with mandatory ethics training and supervised practice upon reinstatement. The board finds boundary erosion, but acknowledges mitigation and self-reporting attempts. The decision is, in bureaucratic terms, merciful. In personal terms, it is a winter. Taylor accepts it with the quiet of someone who knows she is being given a road back, and that the toll is reputation and time. The inquiry into Deacon ends with no adverse finding and a recommendation more symbolism than order that he continue care with an unrelated provider. The file on Sheila remains tangential, her name appearing only as a risk factor. A meteorologic condition stormy, with a chance of knives that altered the calculus of urgency. The aftermath is the point Lee foresaw and feared. Even with no stain on his record, Deacon is tired of being a man other people have to explain. He tells Taylor, through counsel, and then in a letter he never sends, that distance is now the only language that keeps them honest, and he tells Sheila, in a message he does send, that he cannot return to a house that requires him to be both trophy and parole officer. He rents a small place on the edge of the city and learns, again, the geometry of solitude. Taylor begins the long walk back through study, supervision, and the quiet, humiliating grace of being watched while you work. She refuses to call it penance, preferring to call it repair. Sheila looks at the empty side of her bed and understands the paradox Lee engineered and the board solidified. She has been protected from her worst impulse. And in that protection, she has been denied the swift, scorching comfort of a dramatic reunion. What remains is long work amends that are not performative, patience that is not manipulative, a redefinition of love that does not mistake possession for safety. Lee, who set the fuse and absorbed the blast, goes back to rounds knowing that this was the only path that did not end with sirens. In the end, the complaint did exactly what she designed it to do. It pulled Taylor back from a cliff without pushing her into the sea. It put a legal halo of consequence around Sheila that made restraint a rational choice. And it forced Deacon out of a triangle where he would always be somebody's alibi or absolution. But the price of order on the bold and the beautiful is almost always loneliness. And the closing image of this chapter is 3 separate rooms lit by the same unforgiving dusk. Taylor at a desk, annotating an ethics manual with a pen that will not stop shaking. Sheila at a window, hands unclenched, daring herself to let the night pass without a call she will regret. And Deacon on a chair that does not creak like the one in Taylor's office, staring at a blank page where he is meant to write tomorrow's plan, deciding, perhaps for the first time, to be no one's patient, no one's project, and no one's prize until he can be his own.